A little girl had her own seat at the table, but she loved eating with her hands and would wander around, grabbing food wherever she went. Her family was so used to it that they didn't think much of it, but the new governess wasn't about to let it slide.
Viney, please bring Miss Sullivan another plate.
There's nothing wrong with my plate, Captain, only that Helen's hands don't belong in it.
One plate is hardly worth spoiling our breakfast over.
You see, she's just going to keep trying until she gets away.
I must insist that you let the girl go.
The governess had no choice but to let go, but the girl quickly tried to reach into her plate again. This time, the governess had enough and firmly held her to stop her from misbehaving. Frustrated, the girl threw herself to the ground, kicking and screaming, which immediately upset her parents. Her father even scolded the governess, saying she should be more compassionate since their daughter had been deaf, blind, and mute since birth. He insisted there was no need to be so harsh with her. However, the governess shot back, saying it was their lack of boundaries and indulgence that had left the girl behaving like a wild animal. With that, she asked everyone to leave the dining room, locked the door, and prepared to teach the girl proper table manners. Without her parents to back her up, the girl quickly realized that her usual tactics were no longer working. She puffed up in frustration and tried to find her mom, only to discover the room was empty and the door locked. The sounds from inside made the mother anxious, but the governess wasn't about to give in. She firmly carried the girl to her seat and pressed her hands onto the table to stop her from wandering. The girl tried several times to escape, but the governess kept bringing her back. Realizing resistance was futile, the girl climbed onto the table and began stomping on the food. Unable to hear or see, she soon became scared. The governess, equally tense, worried she might hurt herself. Thankfully, she reacted quickly and caught the girl just as she fell off the table. Breathing heavily, the governess carried the girl back to her seat and served her some food. The girl thought the governess had finally given in and immediately reached her hand into the plate again, only to be stopped once more. Eventually, the governess managed to scoop a bite of food with a spoon and feed it to the girl. For a moment, it seemed like she might quietly eat, but the next second, before the girl could react, the governess quickly fed her another spoonful of food. This time, the girl finally swallowed it without fuss. Seeing her improvement, the governess immediately used sign language to praise her for doing well. But to her surprise, the girl suddenly grabbed her hair in frustration. The governess had no choice but to teach her all over again. By the time the girl was finally allowed to leave the dining room, it was already noon. Stumbling her way out, she reached for her mother's arms, while the governess, equally exhausted, stepped out moments later. Just as the mother was about to criticize her for being too harsh, the governess interrupted and said,
Helen ate from her own plate, with a spoon, all by herself, and she folded her napkin.
The mother, who had been worried just moments ago, broke into tears of joy. She had never dared to dream that her daughter might one day learn to take care of herself. The girl's name was Helen Keller. She was born a healthy child into a wealthy family, but at 19 months old, she contracted scarlet fever. The illness robbed her of her hearing and sight, and gradually, she lost the ability to speak as well. From then on, Helen's world was enveloped in darkness and silence. Frustrated and unable to communicate, she grew increasingly irritable and prone to tantrums. The only way to calm her down, even briefly, was by giving her a piece of candy. The sweet taste would momentarily soothe her. But as she grew older, Helen's erratic behavior wore down her family's patience and energy. One day, she went so far as to push her baby brother to the ground. That was the final straw for her father. He decided Helen should be sent to a care facility to spend the rest of her days there. But her mother refused to give up. She firmly believed Helen's actions came from a desperate desire to communicate, not from malice. Holding on to this belief, she spent a significant amount of money to hire a governess named Annie from a school for the blind. On the way back home, Helen's brother asked Annie if she could first teach Helen how to be quiet. Annie, however, replied that Helen needed to learn the language first. If she doesn't understand language, Annie explained, how can she ever know what it means to be quiet? Hearing this, Helen's mother couldn't help but feel puzzled.
She can neither see nor hear, but if it is her senses that are impaired and not her mind, she must have language. Language is more important to the mind than light is to the eye.
Annie's response immediately filled the mother with hope. When they returned home, the entire family suggested that Annie take a moment to rest after her journey. However, she insisted on meeting Helen first. Their first encounter, however, didn't go as smoothly as expected. Although Helen was both deaf and blind, she still relied on her sense of touch and smell to recognize people. Realizing Annie was a stranger, she immediately snatched the teacher's suitcase. Helen's father wasn't impressed with Annie either. From the moment she stepped off the carriage, she hadn't taken off her sunglasses. Sensing his disapproval, the mother quickly explained that Annie had been visually impaired as a child and had nearly lost her sight entirely. It took 9 surgeries for her to regain partial vision. Even now, Annie still needed to wear sunglasses to protect her eyes from strong light. Hearing this, the father complained. Meanwhile, Helen had already opened Annie's suitcase and started rummaging through it. It wasn't until she found the doll Annie had brought for her that she finally calmed down. She carefully felt the doll's face, then touched her own, realizing they were similar. Delighted, she clung to the doll, unwilling to let go. Annie seized this opportunity and began spelling out the word doll with her fingers, guiding Helen to feel the shapes. To her surprise, Helen's memory and imitation skills were extraordinary. After just one demonstration, Helen accurately replicated the gestures for doll, leaving Annie overjoyed. However, Helen's brother poured cold water on her enthusiasm, dismissively saying that his sister was just like a monkey mimicking movements and didn't truly understand the meaning behind the gestures. Annie, unfazed, explained that imitation was the first step in learning. As long as Helen could learn to spell letters, she would eventually grasp their meanings. She then politely ushered the brother out of the room. Taking the doll from Helen's hands, Annie intended to continue the lesson, but Helen erupted into a tantrum. To soothe her, Annie took a piece of cake out of her bag. Helen's sharp sense of smell immediately picked up the sweet aroma. Annie broke off a small piece, fed it to her, and then taught her to spell cake. When Helen correctly mimicked the gestures, Annie rewarded her with a larger piece, hoping to show her that accurate gestures would get her what she wanted. Annie then returned to teaching the word doll. Though Helen resisted at first, she eventually complied and completed the task. But as soon as she got the doll back, she locked Annie in the room, snatched the key, and left. Coincidentally, her brother witnessed the entire scene. It wasn't until lunchtime that the parents learned Annie was trapped in the room. Helen's mother searched her thoroughly but couldn't find the key. With no other options, her father fetched a ladder and carried Annie out through the window. Later that day, when everyone had gone, Annie quietly approached Helen to see what mischief the little troublemaker would come up with next. Helen cautiously felt her surroundings, making sure no one was around, then pulled the hidden key out of her mouth.
Oh, you little devil.
This showed that Helen's mind was fine. However, figuring out how to discipline her without causing harm left Annie at a loss. In search of guidance, she decided to write a letter to the principal for help. Just then, Helen sneaked into the room and accidentally knocked over a bottle of ink on the table. While cleaning up the mess, Annie seized the opportunity to teach Helen how to spell ink. She even guided Helen's hand to try writing the word. Unexpectedly, Helen got pricked by the pen tip. The sudden pain sent her into a fit of rage, and she began smashing the doll. Hearing the commotion, Helen's mother hurried in, cleaning up the mess. Annie firmly stated that as long as Helen learned enough words, she would eventually understand. With that, Annie gently touched Helen's hand with the tip of her pen. Just as the two were talking, Helen suddenly poked Annie with the pen. Her mother quickly pulled her aside, but this only made Helen more agitated. In a hurry, her mother shoved a piece of candy into her mouth, which left Annie utterly confused. During meals, this girl not only grabbed food with her hands but also liked to walk around the table while eating, taking food from other people's plates. Yet, her family didn't stop her and seemed to have gotten used to it. Why? Because Helen was deaf, blind, and unable to speak. Only the newly arrived governess, Annie, couldn't stand it. After a tremendous amount of effort, she finally managed to get Helen to sit at the table and eat with a spoon. But instead of appreciation, her efforts were met with doubt from Helen's parents. Helen's father thought Annie's teaching methods were too harsh. He warned her that if she wanted to stay, she'd have to change her attitude and show a little more sympathy for Helen. This poor girl. However, Annie immediately pushed back. She argued that it was precisely because of them that Helen had become so spoiled. To Annie, Helen's biggest obstacle wasn't her blindness or deafness but their overindulgence. After that, Annie brought the couple to an abandoned cottage nearby and suggested teaching Helen there alone. This way, they could still see their daughter every day, but Helen would lose her parents' constant protection and stop being so unruly. Helen's father didn't agree with Annie's approach, but her mother believed that given time, Annie could educate Helen well. Seeing his wife's hopeful expression, Helen's father reluctantly agreed to give Annie 2 weeks. If Helen didn't show any improvement by then, Annie would have to leave. The next morning, the servants cleaned up the cottage. When Helen's brother came over with the luggage, he mockingly asked Annie if she planned to tie Helen to a chair to teach her. But Annie's serious expression made his smirk fade. He then asked earnestly why she didn't feel pity for Helen. Annie's words finally made Helen's brother understand her teaching philosophy for the first time. Meanwhile, to create the illusion of being far from home, Helen's parents took a detour, driving 2 hours before arriving at the cottage. When Helen cautiously stepped inside, she realized she was in a completely unfamiliar place. She grew anxious, gesturing desperately to call for her parents. Her mother instinctively wanted to comfort her, but Annie firmly stopped her. Despite the pain and worry in their hearts, Helen's parents knew they had to leave for her growth. As they walked away, Helen was left behind, fumbling helplessly in the cottage. Eventually, she found a hand to hold, only to discover it belonged to the person she disliked the most. Annie. That's when it dawned on Helen. Her parents had intentionally left her here. Overcome with fear and anger, she crawled under the bed and refused to come out, even late into the night. Worried she might starve, Annie had no choice but to wake Percy, a worker from Helen's household. The moment Helen felt Percy's familiar hand, she finally crawled out from under the bed. But her resistance toward Annie remained strong. Annie, thinking quickly, taught Percy the sign for cake, hoping he could help. As Percy practiced, Helen curiously reached out to feel their hands. Realizing they were signing, Helen spelled out cake on Percy's hand. When she got it right, Annie immediately brought her a piece of cake. That's when Helen realized, if she signed the gestures Annie taught her, she could get food. However, she still didn't understand the deeper meaning of sign language. Annie continued teaching Percy other words, but Helen, feeling competitive, pushed Percy aside and took the initiative to learn herself. This delighted Annie, as Helen was finally willing to learn. When Helen successfully signed the word milk, Annie immediately brought her some. Satisfied and full, Helen climbed into bed and drifted off to sleep, content for the first time. In the days that followed, Annie helped Helen experience the world in new ways. They strolled through lush green fields, played by cool rivers, smelled the fragrance of flowers, and even shared the joy of feeling baby birds hatch. Before long, more than half of the 2 weeks had passed. Helen's mother, unable to hold back any longer, came to visit. To her surprise, she found that her daughter had not only learned to stay quiet but had also become polite during meals. Seeing Helen's transformation, her mother was filled with relief and joy. However, Annie believed this progress was far from enough. She insisted that Helen needed more time for further education. But Helen's mother, overwhelmed with longing for her daughter, couldn't accept the idea of waiting any longer. Realizing time was running out, Annie worked tirelessly, reviewing previously taught words with Helen over and over. Helen, too, put in great effort, even unconsciously practicing the gestures in her sleep. Yet, she still couldn't grasp the meaning behind the signs and often confused some of the words. Despite Annie's relentless corrections, it seemed futile. Finally, the last day arrived. Helen's father brought a dog as a graduation gift for his daughter. Annie, however, tried to argue for just one more week. But Helen's father felt that having his daughter behave so well was already enough. Helen's father ultimately rejected Annie's proposal, stating that Helen could only stay until 5 p.m. Back at the cottage, Annie urgently tried to teach Helen the word for dog. However, Helen still didn't understand. She kept making random gestures for water on the dog. Even when Annie brought her water to clarify, nothing worked. At that moment, Annie could no longer hold back her frustration. She desperately wanted Helen to grasp the meaning of just one word. If Helen could understand even a single word, Annie believed she could teach her about everything in the world, even how to speak. But time had run out. When Helen was taken back home, Annie was left with an overwhelming sense of defeat. Memories of her childhood in the orphanage flooded her mind. Annie had once had a younger brother, but he tragically contracted a fatal illness. When the staff found out, they immediately separated the siblings, and Annie never saw her brother again. She lived with regret, blaming herself for not fighting harder to see him one last time. That was why, from the moment she met Helen, Annie instinctively wanted to save this little girl trapped in darkness. Back at home, Helen quickly reverted to her old ways. First, she removed all the keys from the doors and brought them to her mother as a test. Once she realized her family still doted on her as before, she resumed her antics. During dinner, Helen repeatedly threw her napkin onto the floor and started grabbing food with her hands again. Annie immediately took away her plate, which made Helen furious. She began kicking the table in frustration, clearly testing her family's boundaries. As expected, her mother picked her up and cradled her, just like always.
Give in to her then. She's the one who'll pay for it.
Everyone fell silent. Was this really the life they wanted for Helen forever? In the end, Helen's mother steeled herself, prying her daughter's hands open, ready to send her back to the cottage. But this time, her father refused. He insisted that Helen should stay at the table, arguing that her life was already miserable enough, and a little leniency wouldn't hurt. Annie had no choice but to compromise, though this only emboldened Helen. Not only did she throw away her spoon and napkin again, but she also began grabbing food with her hands. Moments later, she stood up, intending to roam around the table as she had done before. When Annie stopped her, Helen grabbed the water pitcher from the table and furiously splashed water on her. At that moment, Annie's patience finally reached its breaking point. Helen was carried out forcibly. Without the protection from her parents, her defiance quickly faded. Annie, holding Helen's hands, began pumping water while letting her feel the flow. At the same time, she traced the word water into Helen's palm. As the water trickled through her fingers, a profound sensation stirred within Helen. It was as if she had suddenly understood something. The water pitcher slipped from her grasp and shattered on the ground. Helen touched her damp hand to her lips and tried to say the word water. Seeing this, Annie immediately increased the pace of pumping. A strong stream of water gushed forth, and she quickly took Helen's hand, nodded, and repeated the word water. At that moment, Helen finally connected the gestures with the physical object, and for the first time, she spoke the word aloud. Helen's curiosity was completely ignited. Whatever she touched, Annie immediately explained through sign language. The ground, the grass, the flowers, a vibrant and lively world gradually unfolded in Helen's mind. She was so overjoyed that she was nearly overwhelmed. For the first time, she was no longer an isolated island. She had finally discovered a way to connect with the world. When Helen took her mother's hand, Annie immediately signed to explain, "Mother." Then she moved on to her father. Helen curiously touched the beard on his face, then reached back, gesturing for Annie to continue explaining. But it was only then that she realized Annie wasn't standing beside her. Fumbling around, Helen eventually found Annie and gently patted her, as if asking what to call her. Annie took Helen's hand, smiled, and signed, "Teacher." Helen approached her mother and asked for the key to her room. With the key in hand, she turned and handed it directly to Annie. This simple act wasn't just a gesture of respect or trust, it was Helen's way of expressing acknowledgement of Annie's role in her life. From that moment on, Annie became an indispensable part of Helen's life as her teacher. With that, the movie comes to an end. The Miracle Worker is based on the true story of Helen Keller. In the years that followed, Helen graduated with honors from Radcliffe College, the women's division of Harvard University, and wrote her autobiography, The Story of My Life. This book became a timeless treasure, inspiring and enlightening countless young minds. At the age of 84, Helen was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom by President Johnson, solidifying her place as one of the greatest American heroes of the 20th century. For someone who was both deaf and blind, these accomplishments were nothing short of a miraculous feat. And at the heart of this miracle was Anne Sullivan, Helen's teacher and mentor. Before meeting Helen, Annie was an ordinary woman with neither a prestigious background nor extensive teaching experience. She faced skepticism from her employers and resistance from Helen herself, yet she possessed extraordinary love, boundless hope for the future, and unwavering determination in the face of endless challenges. What are your thoughts on this remarkable film? Feel free to share them in the comments, and I'll see you in the next movie.